you ready for the incredible sound of classic rock? No? Good, because now it's time for Visiting the Village.
And welcome to Visiting the Village. My name is Paul Kilduff-Taylor, and joining me as ever is the astonishing Ian Hardingham.
Hello everyone. I spent part of this week making a better version of Frozen Synapse time handles. An event none of us thought would ever happen, but it's very exciting.
Let's get out of that dungeon.
It's the top story.
TinyBuild have sent an email to Eurogamer where they claim key reseller G2A has sold $450,000 worth of its games. CEO Alex Nichiporchik accused G2A of facilitating a, quote, black market economy. G2A are claiming that TinyBuild's existing distribution partners are the ones reselling keys, and also responded with a statement asserting that they want to work together with developers and publishers. Is mass key reselling now here to stay?
It may be, but not of this type, I do not believe. The key reselling where you buy an awful lot of Humble Bundles, for instance, or an awful lot of copies of a game when it's on sale, that seems to me to be relatively hard to stop unless you use a very specific solution like what Steam's come up with. But in a situation like this, which appears to be about fraudulent credit card transactions, what's going to happen is that we're going to find ways of automatically cancelling keys as soon as the purchasing process has failed. And I think that's just going to be fairly straightforwardly happening. Steam have already created a system which is getting on to sorting out a lot of these problems. And I think that actually one of the bigger questions here is how non-Steam people are going to deal with this.
Right, yes. I think a really huge part of this is to do with smaller distributors, as you say. G2A are saying that sort of they're the ones reselling them, which I think is massively disingenuous. But that is kind of where the leak is happening. I think it might lead some developers and publishers to not go outside of Steam. These other sites like Bundle Stars and Indie Gala and so on, I think might suffer from that to some extent. I think I agree with you. I don't think there's anything we can reasonably do to stop this now. It's happened so many times. The big threshold for me was when it happened to Ubisoft and they didn't take legal action against G2A. I very much doubt that TinyBuild will, and I very much doubt that any of the other indie developers will, because it's still not a significant sort of dent to them.
I don't think people are generally going to take action against G2A, but I think people are going to find generalized solutions to a lot of the places where this happens. Again, Humble Bundle's a really difficult one to deal with because you can't sell something for one cent or even $1 and then negate that later on. If you're selling via these flash sales, you are vulnerable to this, although Steam again are doing some interesting work trying to stop that. But anything that's to do with the fraudulent stuff, you definitely can stop. Now, I think G2A is becoming a big deal.
Yeah.
And I do think that people are going to start demanding, developers and publishers are going to start demanding protection with Steam sales. And I think that, as you say, this is really, really bad for the smaller distributors. And I think Steam's going to basically find a solution that works. And it's gonna really stop a lot of publishers putting out content on other platforms, and that's actually kind of a really bad side effect of this.
Yeah, I agree. I think we're really, really in agreement on this. I mean, having looked at this issue quite a lot, G2A have done everything right in terms of if you were doing this practice, which has certainly kind of fairly direct legal implications and probably some moral implications. If you were doing this, you would do exactly what they've done, which is to make it look as legitimate as humanly possible. Even in this article by the CEO of TinyBuild, who is annoyed with them, he's using their terminology. He's saying G2A is like an eBay for game keys. That's their phrase that they've been trying to get people to use. So they've basically done everything perfectly, and now they're in this incredibly strong position. And the only way to solve that is if you go for a more centralized thing, such as Steam. And I don't see that as being good in any way. I think it's going to cause a huge negative effect. And I don't think G2A are now so large and stories like this are going to keep happening. People won't want to ignore them anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's no point attacking G2A. You know, it seems like most of the time nowadays online, what happens when you really want to get rid of negative behavior like this is that you just have to make it not work, unviable. You don't go via lawsuits. It's so hard to sue people. Everything's international now. Yep. It's just incredibly hard, costs a lot of money, and people generally do have the tools to sort out stuff like this. I think that this is so much worse than piracy. I'm really upset by the idea of other people profiting from a pirated game of mine. Whereas I don't get particularly viscerally upset about people pirating my game, especially if they really can't afford them. Yeah. I think it's a different level. And I think people care a lot about it, and I honestly do think that something's going to happen with this. I don't think G2A are going to continue rising like this. I think unchecked they would do. But I think that like the very slow gears of motion of people like Steam and other distributors are going to find a good solution. You've got to remember as well that a lot of the people who are annoyed about this are really good programmers. They're the kind of people who can make a really good solution. And I wouldn't be surprised to see maybe some kind of open source CD key system that allows you to put some checks and balances on this kind of thing. It may be that flash sales, when you're not using Steam, you have to register the account within 7 days. I could imagine there being some punitive things that go on around there to try and fix this, because no one's happy that they're basically not being allowed to set the price of their product.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the other issues here is really just that it could be legalized. And if it is, G2A are in the prime position to capitalize on this now. Innovation before legislation is what they said to me. And the way that they want to portray it, which I don't think they believe internally actually, is that they're basically Napster, and that this is going to go towards a situation where it's either legalized or legitimized, and they're going to be like the first mover there.
I kind of view that as slightly orthogonal, because whether or not it's made legalized or legitimized, people are always going to want to be able to sell their game for the price that they want to sell it, and they're going to want to use flash sales. And I don't think, even if this is legalized in a meaningful way, I don't think that's going to stop the game developers and publishers finding systems to undermine it.
Sure. Give me 1 second. And I'm back. No Man's Sky developer Hello Games has revealed a 3-year-long lawsuit brought by broadcasting giant Sky, according to Eurogamer. Sean Murray said, "This is the same folks who made Microsoft change SkyDrive to OneDrive. So it was pretty serious." He said they have now settled the issue. Does trademark law need a reform?
Well, I mean, probably. I don't know enough about it to say definitively whether it does or not. You know, we're relatively mature about this kind of thing on the podcast. We understand that trademarks are important to companies, and that sort of bringing action, even in sort of really bad cases, is part of protecting your trademark. So while that may be something that should be reformed, we do understand that. I mean, Sky seems like a word I don't want to be trademarked.
I know.
And I also think that No Man's Sky is much less egregious than SkyDrive. I can go for Microsoft having to change SkyDrive, honestly, just about. But No Man's Sky seems absolutely ridiculous, so I guess maybe the answer to this is yes.
I think it does. I'm fed up of these stories, especially for it's allowing larger companies to prey on smaller companies. If he used the word settle, I don't know if he used that in a technical sense or not, and it's really not clear from this post exactly what happened. But if they've had to pay money to do this, that is absolutely appalling, and it's a case of systemic manipulation by a large, powerful company.
Yeah, what more can you say? I'm kind of hoping it's not very much, because again, what tends to happen here is that the company just has to be shown to be pursuing the interests, so it doesn't necessarily have to charge a lot. Sky, I don't think, would be actually expecting there to be any sort of actual trademark infringement on this part. Yeah, but you're right. I think it is sort of straightforwardly offensive. I think it's sort of more straightforwardly offensive. Well, I don't know. The Elder Scrolls thing was pretty silly.
Yeah.
And it's just a bit nasty. I don't know what the actual law is, and it seems very silly that you have to keep basically making weird lawsuits in order to keep your trademarks. Nasty.
It's predicated around whether it can reasonably cause confusion between the two products. I think that's fairly close to the pertinent wording here, if not the actual wording. And what happens is that companies will just threaten on the basis of that. And the threat usually consists of a letter that says, this could cause confusion. And so you then have the burden of proof in terms of whether or not it causes confusion, which is what you'd have to argue in court. And with the Scrolls thing, Mojang basically just told Bethesda to go away because it was stupid, and Bethesda realised that they didn't want to fight it in court, so they did, and that cost money to achieve that. You have to pay lawyers to do that. Again, I don't know what happened in this case. So I think I don't just see this as like a sort of necessary aberration of a system that fundamentally makes sense anymore. I think it happens so much now. It's happening more, and it's happening with games where it's so demonstrably clear to a common sense observer that there is no confusion. I mean, yeah, I take your point about the SkyDrive thing. I think that's an interesting one where there could be some confusion, but this just couldn't be in any way. And so now smaller companies have to pay money to defend against that.
When we were renamed Frozen Endzone to Frozen Cortex, one of the names I had jotted down as something I quite liked was Skyball. And I don't think that Sky would have let us get away with that one.
Nor the James Bond IP.
Oh, yes. Well, I think this might have been before Skyfall came out.
Well, we were just prescient. BioWare has decided to leave behind Mass Effect 3's controversial ending choices rather than let them impact the upcoming Mass Effect Andromeda, according again to Eurogamer, who are pretty much our sole source of stories in this post-E3 world. Do games worry about preserving narrative canon too much?
It's a good question. I mean, so Mass Effect 3 had a bunch of choice endings that you could choose, and I'm just trying to work out, how much. If you're trying to make a sequel, especially like a sequel sort of past a trilogy, so somewhat making a new start, having to take into account all of the weird kinds of things that the player could have done at the end of your last one, like what kind of elf hat they were wearing, etc. It's just really annoying. So it just makes sense not to pay any attention to it. But it kind of makes me... It reinforces a belief. I really don't particularly like sort of silly choose-your-own-ending stuff at the end of really, really high-budget, plotty, scripted stuff. I actually, as maligned as it is, I actually really like what Deus Ex did. But I just think it's a difficult question, because while I think everyone would basically agree that the best choice is to ignore the choices, I actually think it also undermines the series a bit.
Yeah, they put so much into this, and there was so much controversy around the endings and all of that stuff previously, that it just seems a bit weird to me that now they're kind of going, oh, that doesn't matter, and then here's something else. But they are saying that was the end of the story. I guess I agree with you about narrative choices, these sort of very discrete branching choices. They never really feel meaningful to me. It feels like they've gone and written 3 substandard endings rather than one good ending, and just for the sake of giving me the choice, which I know is inherently artificial because it's so discrete. There's 3 or 4.
Yeah, it's the wrong compromise. It's definitely too artificial and not freeform enough to be an actually cool thing to do, and obviously it's generally worse than having a really well written ending, as you are implying.
Yeah. NCV and others report that Kenji Inafune has called the launch version of Mega Man-alike Mighty Number 9, quote, better than nothing, close quote. Translation issues aside, are they reaping the Kickstarter nostalgia whirlwind with this game?
This is pretty interesting. This might be the most negative reaction to a released Kickstarter game that I can remember.
Yep.
For those of you who do not know, Mighty Number 9 is very much a spiritual successor to Mega Man. And so it's got a lot of very hardcore fans who really wanted it. I think it's probably... It is selling a little, as far as I can understand. It's not like a complete Dead on Arrival thing. But people are very much unhappy. At the risk of annoying you, I was pretty turned off by how it ended up looking. The original sort of concepts on the Kickstarter looked really great, and it's ended up being this sort of slightly too clean 2.5D thing, sort of which doesn't do it for me. And I'm not the only person who's complained about that. What Kenji Inafune has actually said is they tried their hardest, they did everything they could. We understand it's not perfect, but it is better than nothing. And I can in some ways what he's saying is literally true, I think. He's saying that there'll be sequels if enough people buy this, which probably wasn't the right message. Certainly if I'm a Mega Man fan, this is really seems to be underwhelming to what I was expecting. And someone who's not a Mega Man fan but totally would have bought this, because I understand that Mega Man isn't just an aesthetic IP, it's kind of a gameplay IP as well. It's very, very hard. It has a lot of values associated with it. And, for me, do I want to play something new that has those values that looks really nice on PSN? Absolutely, I do. So I think that they were creating a product that had the right concept, and they've kind of screwed it up.
Yeah, I also think, it's fairly justified people are upset about it. I don't think it looks very good. It definitely doesn't look as good as the concepts this has kind of been gone into. Kind of interests me that you are really setting yourself up for this huge, the burden of expectation is so great. It's $3.8 million of Kickstarter money. People feel very directly invested in this. I made a somewhat substandard joke about this on Twitter, which has caused hundreds of people to mention me with their gripes about this game, and many of them are saying that they're annoyed about this because it's their money. They really feel like it's different to just having bought the game. They've put their money into it, and their money has been used to make something that they don't like. So I think Kickstarter backlash is real, and we're already starting to see the effects of that.
Yeah, there is something unique about this particular game and the response to it. It feels like this is really like a sort of, as if this had been done just by a publisher who ended up sort of spending a bit of money on it, and it basically ended up not being very good. It sort of looks so much like not a passion project. Like it looks so much like a sort of a single A or double A title in lots of different ways. Like it's got some things about it, but loads of things don't work. And so I really like the idea that people who've backed it are just offended that they have helped fund this sort of thoroughly mediocre thing. Like, because usually the problem with Kickstarter stuff is that it's broken, or it's really late, or it's like broken. And this seems to me to be sort of vaguely competent, but just pretty boring.
Yeah, and that's sort of what you dread, really, is that the thing is kind of there, but it's, you can't get your money back because they failed to make it or whatever, and
right.
It's just bad, and that seems to be what's happened here. I guess I will visit the translation topic here. When you have something like this, you've got to have a very specific kind of PR response to it. If you want to try and keep people on side, and the way this has been handled, I mean, it's just unbelievable. Like it's so difficult to craft this thing, and they've kind of come in with this hammer of the developer kind of going, oh well, no, that didn't work. No, that's not going to sit with these people.
Yeah, we definitely post Kickstarter in some ways. Not that Kickstarter isn't a big deal, but we're certainly post the massive part of it. We're still trying to work out how Kickstarter fits in the very long term. Will this stop other things like it being kickstarted? Probably not. It's just a very specific situation. I'm honestly sad about it. I was sort of reasonably excited for this game. There aren't enough 2D games. One thing that he says in this interview, Mr. Unifune, is that there aren't enough 2D games, and he's right. There aren't enough good 2D games anyway on platforms that I'd like to play with high budgets and interesting values. So boo.
Boo. The developer of Defender's Quest has posted an examination of game marketing and development to some extent, where he identifies the structure of bottlenecks which might prevent a given game reaching its sales potential. What did you make of this analysis?
I thought this was sort of decent, sort of fairly entry-level analysis, just sort of asking you to look at the decisions you're making and how they impact your possible sales in a very, very strict way that maybe you're not thinking about. Of course, everyone thinks about how if you're only releasing on one platform, if you're only releasing on the Game Boy Advance, then that's going to massively limit the number of sales you can possibly have. Ditto the language it's in, that kind of thing, and then getting down to sort of more fairy stuff like what's the age rating for your thing, what kind of audience is there, how much are you charging for it. None of these individual items, it's none of them are sort of amazing disruptive ideas of what can and cannot improve your game's sales, but I do think it's interesting to examine them in a slightly different light. I mean, when it comes to the concept of your game, we tend to sort of say a concept is good or a concept is bad. I think, we could have a discussion about whether making a kids game right now is a good idea, and we could maybe do some of this analysis on it. I guess indie developers tend to just think that the pool of people who are in their market for any given game is so large that they're not worried about limiting them with these decisions. They're much more worried about getting some small proportion of their audience that they think that they're targeting anyway. And maybe one of the other ways that you can look at increasing your sales is just looking at really, really basic stuff like this.
Yeah, I thought this was interesting. It's nice to see someone take a structural approach to it. So as you say, people tend to focus on one of these elements, but he's looking at it as a series of bottlenecks that have different relationships to each other. And I definitely agree with that method of thinking. Some of this specifically I think is perhaps not particularly useful in that, yes, you might think that this bottleneck, the bottleneck of reach or the bottleneck of audience is significant, but what you can do in practical terms to change that is actually very minimal, so it's not really worth thinking about. That was kind of one of the problems I had with this. But yeah, the combination of kind of, if you have a concept which is sort of broadly accessible, your inability to reach that market is one of the reasons why games will go on selling at full price for years and years and years after their release, which is what most developers are seeing, just simply because that market wasn't addressed at launch, whereas in a bigger budget title you try and get all those people in earlier. So that's something which is sort of fundamentally good for indie development.
Yeah, I think one of the direct problems with this analysis is I think it's fair to say that there's a big rush on very, in inverted commas, niche titles on Steam right now. The more sort of niche and hardcore a concept, that can often translate into quite wide-ranging sales. I'm thinking of stuff like Farming Simulator and the sort of the legitimate simulator games, not Goat Simulator. I think that sometimes you need to break out of thinking about audience too specifically, because a lot of the most successful Steam games, I think, create their own audience by producing a zeitgeisty thing at the right time.
Audience is often a bad thing to think about when you're starting something creative.
Right.
And I think a good or reasonable thing to think about sort of in the middle and towards the end of it. So I still think with a lot of this stuff, you're never going to get the genre-busting stuff, the really outlier things that take everyone by surprise, if you're thinking very slavishly about, okay, this audience likes this. Because you do, to some extent, have to introduce new ideas to audiences and, new ideas that are going to excite them, and no one can reasonably predict that. But when you've got a good sense of who is interested in your game, for example, once you've put out a trailer and you've seen the way people are talking about it and you've seen the things that people are rushing to compare it to, that's when I think it's helpful to go, okay, well, what do other things do to make this audience happy in a practical way. Just sort of pragmatic things that you can incorporate in your game and in your marketing. That's when it becomes useful. So maybe that's an interesting distinction.
Yeah, I think one of the hardest things to get right, and this is really something that you and I have been discussing a lot in the last month, it's again sort of... we can all agree that accessibility in general is something that's desirable, and we can also agree that sometimes people make big mistakes in the direction of accessibility, where things become less desirable because they have made mistakes in making things accessible in ways which come off badly aesthetically. And I think that getting that right is one of the hardest things. And I think it's something that you and I often take different sides of. It's interesting. I think you're right. You start off with concepting a thing. You don't want to be thinking too much. Well, if you're Activision Blizzard, maybe you do right at the beginning. But if you're us, for instance, you don't want to be thinking too much about the details of how you're going to make this work right at the beginning, when you want to come up with a great, awesome concept that's very exciting and very new and very disruptive. Mm-hmm. When you achieve that, and then when you have to try and work out how to make it feel sort of dangerous and wild, but also not turn people off, like trying to get those two things at the same time, I think is really hard.
Yeah, I think Tokyo 42 is actually quite a good example here, because a lot of what they're doing is very, very new. Like they're doing a set of things that nobody's really done in a game before. It's quite a weird synthesis of stuff. But then as development has gone on, they're using a lot of kind of traditional game logic and a lot of touchstones from other games in terms of how they structure it. Things like weapons, identifiable weapons, which is something we did in FS1. Things like mission structure and so on. They're then bringing in stuff which is recognizable touchstones that are going to help people through. And a lot of accessibility is about people's existing mental models, if you will, of things, so that they don't have to think when they're presented with a decision or something they need to do. That it just relies on stuff that's in their brain already. So there's a huge paradox there, I think, actually.
Yeah, I agree. I think that does Tokyo 42 does that thing well. I just want to finish this with a really good quote from this article that we're talking about. And the quote is this: "Whenever some cool kid says, 'just make a good game and people will buy it,' they're actually talking about a bottleneck." End quote. And I think that's actually really fun, because you've all heard someone say, "You just have to make your game good." But I think this is a really sort of succinct way of putting it. Yeah, you do have to make your game good, and if that's the bottleneck, you're in real trouble. But it's not the only bottleneck.
If you want an article, if you're making games, you want an article that will remind you to take into account all the different things you should think about at different times, then this is a great article for that. It's called Bounds, Bottlenecks and Digital Marketing on fortressofdoors.com. So do have a look at that if it's relevant.
Cool name for a website.
Yeah. Blizzard's Jeff Kaplan has announced that the, quote, avoid player feature will be removed from Overwatch. I like the story. Intended as a function to help limit abuse and harassment, players were, ironically, abusing it to manipulate the matchmaking system into giving them easy matches. Should Blizzard have taken a different approach to fixing this problem?
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine really wanting to avoid a player online. Excuse me while I yawn at another boring case of people exploiting systems on the internet. Yeah, I mean, surely you need that functionality. I mean, people cause other people problems online, and you want to be able to avoid them. Can't you say, well, son, you can only avoid up to 30 people? I mean, I'm kind of intrigued by what process you had to go through to avoid getting good players to play against on this game that has like 50 million active players every day.
Right.
But I mean, I don't think they can just remove this feature.
No, I think that sounds like a great feature, especially for, in StarCraft 2 you used to get those people who would like stream snipe, pro players. They'd wait until that player was looking for a game, they'd try and queue their game at the same time to make sure they got them loads of time. That's terrible. You need to be able to avoid players, I think. But, actually, thinking about this, I think it might be a symptom of Blizzard's sort of general behaviour, because why would you want a situation where you're not getting hard matches? It's so that you want to just like have a good win rate, so you want to get all the like nice, happy, encouraging stats up and not your actual stats. I'm going to roll this into a listener question, which was from friend of the podcast Alex Malakian-Hayes, who is going around saying that he's the 100th best player of this particular character in the world because Blizzard's ranking system has put him there with the total number of points he's achieved in matches, not to do anything to do with like his kill-death ratio or his win ratio or anything like that. It's just points that you get for doing useful stuff in the game. He is currently 101 in the world, which is ludicrous because he's clearly not the 101st best person in the world. So I think this is Blizzard's own fault.
Yeah, we talked about this at length last week, and I still am firmly on giving people more control bandwagon, and that these guys have not sorted out rankings, ladders, and matchmaking yet.
It's just interesting that these sort of soft progression mechanics can actually lead to bad player behaviour, because they're just universally seen as like a good thing that keeps people playing and encourages them. But actually, if people focus on them too much, then you can get toxic player behaviour.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know much else to say about it. I mean, it's something that we looked at a lot with... Well, I looked at a lot with FS1 in terms of the kind of things that I wanted out of the system. FS1 ended up being really big. People got really annoyed that the rankings weren't good enough. We've looked at doing Diamond and Silver and Bronze League style stuff. It's just, it's important to look behind this stuff and say, well, what do you actually want us to do? What the players want us to do is for them to feel like they're making meaningful progress every day.
Yeah.
That's quite hard when you're playing the same game as 50 million other people. That's just hard. I mean, that's going to involve lying to you.
Yes, it does.
If you want to feel good about yourself every day.
And Blizzard have really taken the route of fully brute forcing that. There's a lot of stuff they do which is just about making you feel good, in this, and Hearthstone as well is particularly characteristic for that. So it's just interesting to see that there is an actual, a real practical downside to it.
Yeah, it is.
We wait for the police car to pass as we go into the next topic. Wesley Yin-Poole has posted on Eurogamer about a Steam game, Hadean Lands. It's an interactive fiction game. It has DLC item consisting of a PDF certificate, i.e. a piece of paper, that costs £27. The DLC is a certificate that says you, the player, promise to finish Hadean Lands without looking at any hints or walkthroughs on the Steam forums or anywhere else on the internet. Is this good DLC?
I'm like that this is now the point at which a PDF is exactly equal to a piece of paper. That's the most important part of this. This is interesting. I'm all on board with people doing exploratory stuff with DLC. He's come out and said that if you buy this, you'll be more invested in not looking at hints on the internet. This kind of just made me think about how you would make an interactive fiction game that was immune to hints.
Right, okay.
More than the fact of this, which I think is quite fun, definitely silly, and I don't think this is going to spawn a new genre of DLC. But I was really interested, because obviously creators do have a problem with people looking up walkthroughs and guides and stuff. I think that it is a sort of a legitimate design issue that you don't know how much knowledge your players are going to have. Do you design it for the people who will never look at guides and just ignore the ones who will? Do you try and include a hint system, which a lot of people do, to sort of actually increase your audience, talking of audience? Because basically, I guess what people are finding is that the number of people who are just willing to straight play an adventure game or an interactive fiction game without cheating at all or happy to get stuck is very small, and that people obviously have their most frustrating bad user experience when they get stuck. Yeah. This guy didn't want to put tips in his game. So thoughts?
I think I like hint systems, and I think there's a lot that could be done creatively with those that's not explored. Because I don't really want to have to go and look up a walkthrough. But then for a linear adventure game, the walkthrough is always going to be there. It's always going to be an issue.
but with I've got a big problem with hints. I mean, certainly in games that I'm not very invested in, I'm glad to have hints. But it's a very bad decision to be giving your player. Because when I remember the most recent time that I came afoul of hints was in Machinarium, which is a great game. It's incredibly hard, and I'm not an experienced player. And I was constantly having to exercise self-discipline to not click on the hint, and that's not a good thing to force your players to do, because it's just not a fun experience, because you feel bad when you've had the hint. You promise yourself that you don't want to use them again. You've used up some of the game. You wish you'd tried harder. You honestly, most of the time, just wish the option hadn't been there.
Well, I mean, I think that's a badly designed hint system, for one thing. And also Machinarium has some really bad design problems, kind of as you alluded to.
Yeah.
So I think a hint system where, my idea for a hint system was always that you had to go somewhere in the game and you had to do something in order to get the hints. You actually have to do work. But it's not the same as quitting the game and looking up on a website, which is a different kind of really boring work. So if you made it fun, like you had a fun dialogue interaction or something else, like I just feel like there's a whole area of design there which nobody does.
Well, I just think that if your game is a puzzle game, then anything else that you're getting people to do, it's just a weird alternative thing to do. I mean, yeah, sure, it might be cool to give people the option of completing some Mario level instead of finishing this particular thing. And I completely agree that being stuck is not good. And these games tend to trade on how hard they are, which is another weird thing because people want them to be very hard and then they don't want them to be very hard. I don't think I particularly enjoy putting hints in my interactive fiction game. I mean, the thing is that I can totally, to bring it back to the beginning, I can totally imagine being in a scenario where I'm so annoyed by this whole problem, I want to make my game sort of unhintable.
Right.
You find a way of sort of randomizing everything, to the extent to which it's incredibly hard to find in a guide where you actually are and what the right items are. I'd probably rather start off with that system and then try and make a game which is good enough, which tries to not let you get stuck, but not through this thing of like, you're going to try this for half an hour and then it's going to sort of automatically become easier or something. So that's kind of where my mind goes with that.
One of the benefits of hints over walkthroughs is that you could do something like, for example, one common problem in an adventure game is that you haven't visited all of the accessible areas yet. And the item that you need is in one of the areas. So having a system where you could say, actually, there are unvisited areas, and you need to spend your time looking for areas instead of looking at the items that you have or looking for items in existing areas. That's a kind of hint I'd really like, because that doesn't really spoil the game in any way. I don't feel like I've...
I totally agree. I think that's a good idea, and I kind of like, I'd be tempted to put that in a different category, like almost of a user interface thing rather than a hint system.
Sure. Yeah. No, that makes sense. Finally on this, it's such an interesting psychological principle here that if you pay money and get a certificate for something, it makes you commit something more. I think that's probably true just in general. There's something about monetary commitment. There's some experiments about that you can read where even if the amount of money is like 1p, or if it's a token that you're given by someone that has no actual value and you quote invest it in something to do an experiment, I think there's a lot to show that that's very compelling.
Because the thing is that as silly as it all seems, if you're faced with this choice of looking up a solution because you're stuck, I think in a very real way you are compromising the £27 you spent on this thing. To yourself, you're like, well, I can't actually print this out anymore because I looked at a guide. So I think in some ways it does kind of work. When I read this article originally, I didn't immediately think this is just completely troll DLC.
No, me neither.
I think it's not good enough to be a new genre, but definitely sort of interesting.
I think, the behavioural stuff is so interesting to me. Like, there's this other thing where if you want someone to consider options properly, what you do is you have them argue the case of the opposite option to their current belief in detail. So they have to look into the case and argue it, and then you find that people immediately, their actual view changes to become more neutral, even if it's very dogmatic to start with. And so sort of arguing the case for not looking up a hint, which this kind of is, it has all this language about that you're making this commitment and so on. You're really thinking about the idea of looking up a hint. It makes it bad. It makes it like having a cigarette if you're trying to quit smoking. That's really cool. So I'd like developers to do more sort of, I guess, direct behavioural stuff like this. Very interesting.
Yeah.
Chinese titan Tencent, who happen to own Riot as well as a huge number of other things, confirmed yesterday that it has agreed to buy Supercell, makers of Clash of Clans and Clash Royale and other things, in a deal that values the Finnish games company at around $10.2 billion. Blog Zhug EX, which is a really interesting blog, has broken down all the details of this. Do you think Tencent's dominance can be challenged?
Yes, I think it'll just be challenged by the ever-evolving nature of games, to be honest. I mean, I think that there's going to be another massively disruptive free-to-play game that'll come along soon. Sure, maybe Tencent will buy it, maybe. But they're, sooner or later they're going to start having spent too much money trying to chase sustainability. League of Legends is doing pretty well.
Yep.
And there's nothing to suggest that Clash of Clans is going to go anywhere, except the experience of what's happened in every other game ever. That there will be something that changes, and because the barriers to entry, even in this insane part of the market, the barriers to entry are still incredibly small. We're not talking about manufacturing dishwashers or worse, dishwasher tablets here. There are a huge number of new entrants into the marketplace every single year, and things are cyclical. The difference between Tencent and Acti Blizzard is that Blizzard are a developer themselves who have clearly the ability to do to keep making new great games. So that's like a better position to be in. It's still not the safest position in the world, but Tencent can continue injecting cash into the industry that we're in, and that's great. I don't think that there isn't much negative happening from this.
Yeah, I agree. I think one of the more interesting aspects of this is a good financial breakdown here, is that Supercell's non-hits are actually very, very good. The extent to which that's driven by the existing popularity of their existing games and can be replicated by someone else and so on is obviously there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably because they, just to take a really basic viewpoint that I'm sure you'll basically agree with, they've obviously got a marketing strategy that works, even with sort of reasonably bad games. And they're spending a lot more on, well, Boom Beach isn't a bad game, I know. But I actually know some people who like Boom Beach. But yeah, sorry, please go on.
Yeah, no, Boom Beach is a sort of crazy hit as well. It does interest me that, they're very characterized as a sort of one-hit wonder company, and I wonder if their development approach will allow them to replicate again. I mean, Clash Royale, it seems to be popular in a different way. And yeah, you're right to bring up Blizzard. Blizzard are really interesting. I'm going to keep beating myself up about this. I called Overwatch being a failure. I thought it was a really weird genre misstep from them. I thought it was like MOBAification of something, which I think is generally a bad idea. And all of that was completely wrong. Their development and marketing approach has created this absolutely enormous hit, which kind of actually overtook LoL for a while in the Korean market, which is completely unheard of. So you're right, disruption will happen, but maybe the disruption will just come from within these existing titanic organizations.
Yeah, certainly I think I think it's probably, let's put it this way, I think it is cheaper to try and make an interesting disruptive mobile free-to-play game to the point where you develop to the point where it looks promising, and then you get some serious funding. There are probably going to be a lot more competitors to, say, Clash of Clans in the next 3 years than, say, Overwatch or League of Legends.
Yeah.
So sure, I mean, you'd certainly imagine that Supercell had a good shot of a better percentage chance per game they make of carrying things on, but they're competing against a lot of people, and there will be some kind of titanic shift eventually as well that we're not even sort of taking into account. There'll be some complete change in how people use their phones or what phones look like. It's cool. I'm sure if I'm Tencent and I've got $1 million, then I'm happy to buy this thing and hope to get a good return. But it doesn't seem like a hugely safe investment to me. It feels like we're in a very changing world. But there you go.
It is, yeah, I suppose they're coming in quite late as well. Another interesting aspect of this was sort of original investor SoftBank, who had a 72.2% stake in Supercell, and they estimate that they've got an $8.4 billion return on their original investment.
Pretty good.
So they obviously kind of got in at the right time, and they'll be happy about Tencent coming in. So
they're going to make so much more per dollar than Tencent will. You know, but
very
I mean,
possibly.
we're talking about investment 101 here. I mean, of course, it's more exciting to get it on the ground floor with something before it goes major than be one of these huge companies that buys the already established thing, which sort of certainly anecdotally seems to go wrong more than it goes right in games. But I haven't done any kind of analysis on that.
Interesting. Non-gaming now. Quantum Magazine published an interview with cognitive scientist Donald Hoffman where he argued that the world presented to us by our perceptions is potentially nothing like reality. Here's how this is tangentially related to this podcast. He talks about the computer desktop as a relatively recent metaphor for how an apparent reality which suits our brains, which we feel is natural, can be almost completely divorced from the objective truth of what's happening, files moving around inside a computer and so on. Do you think there's any weight to these arguments?
Well, so I've read this, I've thought about it a fair amount. I think he uses a lot of terms which are sort of on their own fairly reasonable, but I think that my opinion on this is a bit time cube. There's one thing especially that he's latching onto that I just don't agree with. He says that quantum mechanics have basically shown that there's no such thing as an object that just exists in space. And that is, well, basically that's what he's saying. What I would say is that quantum mechanics has shown that at the particle level, an intelligent or at least a complex observer has an impact on what a particle is doing. So the universe is changes a little bit with what we're looking at, but not to the extent that a table isn't a table. And I think he's very much saying that that's kind of one of the bases of his argument. It's lots of things he goes into here, and I just basically reject that. And I think it gets a bit more time cubey when he starts talking about his model of what a human is like, and then starts being a bit circular with what you can do with that. What was your reaction to this?
So this, yeah, I think there's a lot of merit to your criticism of this. I think there's also the sense that he's really struggling to articulate this outside of his field to some extent. But the few things he said really interest me. One of them is that fitness, evolutionary fitness, does not correlate with proximity to objective reality. And that's the main thing that he's refuting. So he's done some studies involving computers, I believe, that he thinks prove that if you have an agent that can accurately perceive its reality, that does not make them better at surviving than an agent whose perception is tuned specifically towards the task of surviving. It's a bit linguistically difficult, that. But that really interested me because you would think that it was necessarily true that if you could perceive things accurately, you would be better at surviving. But when you think about that in abstract, why would that be true?
Yeah, I don't have a... I mean, I think that's... It certainly makes sense to me that when I think about that supposition, I look at it in different terms. You've only got a limited amount of processing power in your head. So I would say it was automatically true from my perspective that evolution is going to be about finding the right ways of processing reality, which to me just doesn't... he's the example that he uses is if you've got an agent who can tell you exactly how much water is in a lake, then that's less useful or possibly exactly as useful as an agent that can just tell you whether there's not enough, that you're not going to have enough to drink, or there's too much because you're going to drown or something.
Right.
But that just seems sort of fairly straightforwardly fair. He's talking about that issue because that's the first thing people bring up to him when they want to disagree with his general views. They say, surely evolution would just root out the guys who weren't seeing the universe accurately, and that's just not a criticism that I would come at him first at. I think it's interesting, but I think that if we saw the universe through a different lens, rather than the one that's light in our processing, I think it would look pretty eerie. I think it would be very disorienting and a bit scary, but I think it would not. I think when you learnt to process that image, I don't think it would look markedly different to the image that we have. And yeah, sorry, just to be my biggest criticism here is that he definitely talks about quantum mechanics in magical terms, and it's sort of saying that it is, as different from classical physics as it could, is massively different, and I just don't agree with that. I view quantum mechanics as the next step of understanding our universe, and we've been using a lot of assumptions in classical physics that are not technically true. But just because of that does not mean that classical physics is completely wrong. It's just it just starts getting things wrong at the very small level.
Yeah. The extent, I think philosophically, it's never right to infer that you need to throw absolutely every precedent out, which is kind of what his language implies here. He's basically saying, cognitive neuroscientists have used a Newtonian model to explain the brain for a long time, and they need to start using other things. And that just means that everything's wrong. There's a leap there, which is not, I think, just necessarily true in abstract, without having a good understanding of all these issues. And it may just be the way that he's presenting these arguments, for a general audience. That doesn't seem right. That's really like baby bathwater type situation. But I like this because I find it challenging. There's the traditional stuff, sort of philosophical stuff, like Descartes talking about the stick in the water and saying it would be ridiculous if there was a malicious demon that was manipulating our reality to make us not see things. Actually, that's quite a non-useful view as well. So I feel like, as a general understanding of how we perceive things, and also allowing for the fact that there might be things beyond our perception which are happening, which I think quantum mechanics does lead us to, it's kind of an interesting way of looking at it.
Yeah, I agree. As a final thing about this, he says that he talks about snakes, and he talked about the snake being a symbol, a symbol of a bunch of processing in our brain that means things that we have to then respond to. A snake is a part of our processing algorithm. So that's true, right? That there's nothing wrong with that. That's going down one particular model. And that's absolutely fine. I don't disagree with that. He sort of says that just because we have to take these symbols seriously doesn't mean we have to take them literally. Well, here's where I think I diverge a little bit. If we don't understand the snake, then we can't predict what the snake might do. It's all very well saying a snake is a thing that you don't want to be near. That's fine, but sometimes you need to get near a snake. And obviously, a lot of our competitive advantage as sort of conscious thinking beings is having like the depth of understanding of the universe to be able to predict what may happen, as well as just be able to say this is bad and this is good. So I do think that when it comes to that, having a detailed understanding of the things that are important to us, and a fairly realistic one, does become a competitive advantage.
That's an interesting point of view, because you're basically saying that things that are a function of our perception are perhaps more interesting than just how our perception works. And his argument is a bit like saying, oh, if the state of this thing can only be 1 or 0, then you can't do a complex calculation with it because it's so limited, I think. It's almost like saying the base components of something are too limited to allow it to have useful output, which I think is a specious argument.
Yeah.
Cool. Wow. I hope you survived that topic, listeners. That's enough of that. Let's talk about TV to bring it back into the realms of reality. So we've both watched the first episode of the new season of Orange is the New Black.
Yes.
And we both like it. What are your thoughts?
I've always been a huge fan of Orange is the New Black. I'm certainly not on my own. It's got, I don't know how they managed to get like a 500 really interesting characters.
Yeah.
And it never feels overstuffed to me. It's just got a bunch of great people in it. Great actors. I don't know how they've managed to do it so consistently. Every season, I think that they do something new to really push things together. I think the most interesting decision they made was to sort of slightly sideline the main character.
Yes.
And they're just doing that. From a review I read of the whole series, they're just sort of doing that further and further, just making her one of the 50 billion characters. So, it's hard for me, honestly, to find much criticism about it. I don't think you can binge watch it.
No,
I certainly can't. Like, if I watch 5 in a week, then I might take a week off.
Yeah,
I just really like it, and I happen to be one of the guys who really likes the theme tune.
I hate the theme tune so much.
There you go.
Wow. It's awful. Let's not talk about that. It interests me because as you say, they've done this thing of retracting the role of the main character, which is incredibly dangerous, but has worked. And it does make it more like a soap. And when things become soapy, I tend to get annoyed with them and frustrated. And for some reason, I think it's because of the way the storylines are handled quite skillfully, and the individual storylines are interesting and unpredictable. Well, which you could kind of say about a soap.
I mean, I think I could probably
unusual.
talk endlessly at the pub about what the soap line is, because I'm the same. As soon as something crosses the soap line for me, I'm just completely out. A lot of shows that have really good first seasons, so for example, Big Love, they often just descend into being a soap after that. When they lose their kind of one very clear direction, and start just being about recirculating all these characters in different situations, it gets me all the way out. I think Orange is the New Black is not a soap. I think one of the reasons for that is the sort of the prison, the aspect of the movement through the prison is quite consistent, and people do actually develop and stay developed. But I do think it's closer to the soap line than a lot of things I like.
Yeah. No, the thing that interests me is it manages to do that well in a way that I like. And there's something about, as you say, that characters do develop and change in a meaningful way. They don't just sort of switch to be good or bad, which I think can happen in a soap. That's the most common change. The character development is subtle and persistent, and the narrative stuff is very well handled. Yeah, it's interesting. I got very bored of it at the end of the last season, but as you say, I think that came from just watching it too much. As an occasional watch, it's good, and I think that's because, as you said earlier, it does have a very strong structure, and as soon as you start sort of detecting that too much, it gets boring. But yeah, it's interesting, and I want to see what they do with it.
Yeah, we're big fans.
So the other thing we've been watching is, I don't know how much you've been watching, but the Euro 2016 football.
I've watched a fair amount.
Yeah, I've managed to watch 3 matches recently, 2 of which were 0-0 draws.
Yay!
And that was interesting. I don't mind the odd 0-0 draw. You know, I'm a seasoned football spectator. I can cope with that. But I was thinking yesterday just about how badly designed these tournaments are, that they lead to a lot of dead games where one side doesn't have to win, or the worst thing, where both sides don't have to win and they don't care. It's just a weird thing to watch. It's weird to have loads of it available at once. It's a big mix.
Yeah, I pretty much like any international tournament that's on all of the time.
Yep.
So even though I'm not the world's biggest football fan, I do like both the World Cup and the Euros, just because it's cool having the sport on all the time, and there's meaningfulness is injected by weird inter-country rivalries. I think you're right about the group stage thing where everyone plays 3 matches. I did think about it after you texted me about it last night, and I do think it's basically just something that you have to deal with. That you want all your teams to play, 3 matches, and the honest truth is that the way that the point system work in these things, very often most people have decided after 2 matches. And I'm not sure there's much you can do about that. I mean, you could make it Swiss, which is where you sort of start splitting people into tiers based on every result. So you're kind of always against someone who's so you would, if you won your first match, you would then be playing against someone who also won their first match.
Okay.
So it wouldn't. I mean, it's not. I don't think it's appropriate for a tournament like this, but it does mean that you don't have this kind of. It doesn't matter to this person. It does matter to this person thing.
I wonder if anyone's ever tried double elimination in a format like this. I mean, the hated double elimination, but
double elimination. The only major tournament I've ever watched that uses double elimination is the college baseball.
Okay,
and it's great. It's really cool. You have to lose twice in a row to be eliminated. It's really awesome. I think if you've got enough time to do that, one of the best things about baseball is you can play it every single day. Then it's a really cool format.
Yeah, the high number of matches. That's right. That's the big downside, and also the sort of slight silliness of some aspects of double elimination. Yeah, I would like to. Maybe next year they should do it. The other thing I like about these tournaments is the meta storyline. So in this one, there's this problem with the shirts that they rip really easily, which is just like, it's almost like it's been designed kind of for the audience that would like to look at the footballers' bodies, because as soon as they have any contact, you like get rippling abs emerging in a second, which is really hilarious. Stuff like that, and they also managed to destroy the ball in a match I watched recently. Someone stood on the ball and it just collapsed like it was made of paper. So the flimsiness of the equipment is the Euro meta story.
Well, I just the spray paint can thing is still my favourite development in any sport ever.
That's good.
So whenever I get to see that, I'm happy.
There we go. Right, that's enough of that. We traipse back in time now, back to this week in 2006, thanks to me this week. I prepared this. So if there's going to be lots of errors, it's down to that. And thanks to Eurogamer as well. We have Astonishia Story on the PSP.
This looks great. Yes. I've already stealth Googled this, and this looks absolutely cool.
What is it?
It's like it's an RPG, but it's like got a top-down sort of slightly janky pixelated look, and I might go and play this. I'm going to see if I can get this on the Vita.
Okay.
Got a cool
Dynasty
name as
Warriors 5 Empires on the Xbox 360 and PS2.
Yawn.
Full Spectrum Warrior 10 Hammers on the Xbox, PS2, and PC. I've never played a Full Spectrum Warrior game, but 10 Hammers is a great subtitle.
I played the first one, and I was actually asked about this in an interview with a friend of the podcast, Alex Connolly, last week. And I enjoyed it. It was sort of... It wasn't enough like Hidden and Dangerous. Like, Hidden and Dangerous was really hardcore. Like, you do lots and lots of different things. This was a bit more consolified for me, but it was okay.
Grand Theft Auto Liberty City Stories on the PS2. The stories sort of side thing for GTA. I don't know. I know people like this a lot. I don't.
Fair enough.
Loco Roco on the PSP. It was a funny game.
I have played this, and I somewhat enjoyed it.
Outrun 2006 Coast to Coast on the PC.
Now, I played this on the PSP, and this is very good.
Oh, really? Okay.
So, this game, it actually has generative tracks. Somewhat.
Wow.
Basically, it has a bunch of like little half 1 mile segments, and it shifts you randomly to different ones during the course of your run.
Well, amazing.
I like it.
Over the Hedge on PS2, PC, DS, GameCube, Game Boy Advance, and Xbox, which is a terrible film license from a DreamWorks property. Pac-Man World 3 on the GameCube. It wouldn't be this.
Did we need Pac-Man. 3 Pac-Man worlds? I don't think that we did.
Like how you pluralized everything there. Very good. Pro Cycling Manager Season 2006 on the PC. So this is the beginning of the great management and simulator era, as we'll see later on. Red Orchestra Ostfront 41 to 45 on the PC. Not really. Did you play Red Orchestra game? Have I made that up?
I did. I wasn't massively up with it, but this might be this is probably getting towards being the first boxed mod release, isn't it? Actually, maybe I'm way late with that, but this was certainly a famous boxed version of a mod.
Ship Simulator 2006 on the PC, as we said, it begins now in 2006. Tenchu Time of the Assassins on the PSP. I did play a Tenchu game, which I think was on the original Xbox. I think it was quite early on in the Xbox's life, I believe. I may have just completely made this up. And it was interesting. They're really weird games. Very hard, obviously, traditionally, but weird. Wildlife Park 2 on the PC. Yes. Nothing to add. That's the end of that. Let's catapult ourselves forward in time to this week, and it's the top 10 UK Steam games. And we begin at number 10 with DayZ. Number 9 is Grand Theft Auto.
Welcome back, DayZ.
Welcome back indeed. Number 9 is Grand Theft Auto 5. Number 8 is Pillars of Eternity. Still bouncing back into the top 10, Pillars of Eternity. Really persistent game, that. I know a lot of people like that. Total War TM Warhammer registered trademark at number 7. Arma 3 Apex at number 6. That's the DLC, I believe. Counter-Strike Go at number 5, Payday 2 Game of the Year Edition number 4, Payday 2 at number 3 as well, Dead by Daylight. Now, friend of the podcast and only time guest presenter, Andrew Smith, sent me a tweet about this. He said he's very annoyed about the fact that we keep glossing over this game and saying it's a survival game, when it's not a survival game. It's apparently an interesting asymmetrical multiplayer horror game.
Oh.
developed by Starbeast. He says it's very interesting mechanically, and we should think about it more. It's 4v1, apparently, which is interesting. So I guess this is the sort of fabled attempt to do the fabled sort of director role.
Oh, okay.
Well, no, not director, actually. That's not true. It says survivors play in third person and have the advantage of situational awareness. The killer plays in first person and is more focused on their prey. The survivor's goal in each encounter is to escape the killing ground without getting caught by the killer. So finally, so this is just a proper asymmetric multiplayer, and apparently it's worked. So I that does sound interesting to me. I'm sure it doesn't sound interesting to you because you don't like asymmetric multiplayer or horror.
I don't, but I am kind of intrigued that this has managed to be such a big commercial success.
Yes.
So
perhaps we should look at. Yeah, maybe I'll play that. We should look into it. So thank you for pointing us right on that. If we say something that really annoys you week on week, please get in touch and we'll give it the time it deserves, like we just did there. Arma 3 is at number 1. That is a really boring top 10. Wow. That is really, really dull. I guess no interesting games were released because of E3. So it's all sort of old
no
classics
sensible
coming
ones
back.
anyway.
No sensible questions. Right. That's enough of that. Now it's time for your listener questions, and we're going to start with Tashrike, who asked a question ages ago that I failed to get into the podcast. So you've got to strap in for this one because it's a Frozen Synapse question. You strapped in?
Yep.
Good. Would a time to kill indicator in FS be stepping over the line between good confusion and too much accessibility? If units had a timer bar or a countdown appear over their heads when they engaged, counting down towards the instance where they would kill the enemy, it would make it obvious that engagements were won based on a timer. Most new FS players seem to assume kills were determined by constantly rolling dice until one VATForm, quote, won the dice roll. I think they inferred this from the machine gun, shotgun animations that ran during the engagement. Is this desirable?
I don't desire it right now. I think that there's a lot to like about that. I think that what makes you win and lose engagements is something that's too confusing to new people. I do think that, and this would definitely help because they could see how that number was changing depending on the situation.
Yeah.
I do think that there's quite a fine line with FS between making it too much feel like chess with guns. I don't know if this would be across the line, but I don't love the idea, but I'm definitely going to think about it.
Yeah, I'm kind of the same on this. That's an interesting idea to me. I see the time. So in Frozen Synapse, if you're not aware of it, some people on the podcast won't be, when you engage, it's based on the time it takes for you to shoot your opponent, which is determined by the different factors: how you're aiming, how you're standing, whether you're in cover, whether your opponent is moving, whether you're moving, and so on. And you've been doing some work related to that recently, which we're going to talk about soon. But anyway, so that's that. So it isn't, when you sort of, two units kind of lock on to each other, or one locks onto the other when it's spotted, then it does the calculation to determine who's going to win. And I quite like that that's hidden, actually. I tend to be more on the accessibility side than you. You tend to be a bit more protective of the gameplay, understandably. But I think for me, actually, this is really part of, like, it's part of the micro of the game, not quite knowing when this is and building up your intuitive sense of when you're going to win, when you're going to lose. It feels important to me.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I'm glad we agree on that. So I think it's a nice idea and definitely really interesting to think about, but I probably won't add that.
Yeah.
But it is always good to discuss these kind of things.
To me, it's almost a little bit like displaying the frame count in a fighting game. Like, the length of moves should be something that you internalize by practice and not necessarily something that's displayed. You can get things that do display the frame count for training modes, so maybe it would be interesting as a tutorial feature, perhaps. But yeah, there you go. Right, question from Ben Newhouse now. I'm dying to know what Ian's frustrations are with SteamWorld Heist. Yes, after your offhand dismissive comments last time. I'm playing it now and definitely see some flaws, but nothing as maddening as what he seemed to be experiencing. I wouldn't want you feeding the trolls, but I'd love to hear some thoughtful critique by people who clearly know something about turn-based tactical games. Thank you, Ben. Flattery will always get you everywhere.
Well, the reason why it was an offhand comment was because I know that my problems with SteamWorld Heist are to do with my own subjective things about games and nothing objectively quality based. So basically the reason I bounced off it is because it's not my genre, even though it sounds like it should be. I get very frustrated with most turn-based games because they're sort of very process oriented. You just kind of slowly do a bunch of quite obvious decisions, and you're never in that much jeopardy. And I mean, really, FS was born out of those frustrations. I want everything to be in play every turn. I want things to be able to change based on a tiny difference of position. And I was excited to play a turn-based shooting game. And this turned out to be not my turn-based shooting game. So I want everyone to understand that I am not implying it's a bad game. But as again, this is where this came up, was people can have very legitimate subjective views that can make them very angry, and a creator shouldn't listen to them. The creator of SteamWorld Heist should not listen to me, because my version of SteamWorld Heist would be absolutely nothing like theirs. It would be probably less cute for a start. So there you go.
Interesting, good. David Barrett says, is a bad game better than no game at all? Clearly in reference to Mighty Number 9.
The answer is yes.
Yes.
If that was really the decision, yeah, I'd rather the game existed.
Yeah, I suppose so. Hoaxfish have asked, what frozen food would you say each of your games corresponds to? I haven't had enough time to think about this. Determinants is probably it's probably one frozen fish finger. Frozen Synapse is probably
a frozen middle finger to the industry.
What? A dead person's digit. Okay. Frozen Cortex, I think, is like a frozen peach dessert. And Frozen Synapse 2, I think, is frozen... a very large... Frozen Synapse 2 is the brick of ice cream that friend of the company, Paul Soulsby, ate for his breakfast in a London cafe when I went to see him, having just had a full English breakfast. He then ordered a pie with literally like a brick-sized amount of ice cream on it. So that's what Frozen Synapse 2 is.
Well, I'm not going to try and top that.
Unknown person on Ask FM says, will there be any new game modes for FS2?
Yes.
Dan Marshall says, after a question which I won't answer, okay, fine, serious. In which ways would you like to see AAA studios invest in procedurally generated games to extend their scope, story, quests, etc.? AAA and procedurally generated games have not got on well, particularly. I mean, doing procedurally generated story is so hard. The thing that I really want is a bit more of that stuff in your Bethesdas, in your Skyrims, and in your Oblivions. I'd like to see them gently increase the amount of generated content and have sort of more dynamic stuff happening in the world, something we talked about on the podcast a lot more. And you could do some dynamic story stuff with that. I think it would have to be self-contained, and it couldn't really be part of the main quests or anything like that, but I really would like to see a little bit more experimentation. I feel like those genres have got very staid now.
Yeah, I mean, you know, either an AA studio is definitely going to like fully embrace procedural and related progressive mechanics, and that's interesting to me. I'm not that interested in them putting it in piecemeal. I used to think that I also wanted like randomized quests in Skyrim, but I think that they basically did it in Fallout 4 and it was terrible.
Right.
Because the Bethesda missions tend to be quite bad anyway, even when they're fully designed. Right. They tend to be pretty boring. So it didn't really work. So, I don't know. I've got such weird aesthetic sense about when these things are authentic to me, and AA studios tend to put too much time into shiny polygons, and it tends to, just for me, detract in some areas. And you're right, if they try and do dynamic storyline, that's going to be pretty hilariously terrible. But it's a good question. I haven't got a good answer.
I'd like to see some more stuff like Stalker, and I think a lot of people would like to see that. I didn't really like some of the gameplay and aesthetic elements of Stalker, so I never got really into it. But that idea of
procedurally generated Stalker would be good. I was definitely put off by Stalker being fully designed. Like, I wanted to live in that world, but it'd be more procedural.
Yeah. He also says, have you ever seen a real ghost? Woo, spooky. And the answer to that is no. Alexander Burke asks, what are your thoughts on Neo and Scorpio? I think we kind of covered that last week. I mean, Neo and Scorpio are such different plays that, yeah, I don't even know if they're directly comparable.
I had a conversation with Visiting the Village pub correspondent Adam Hunt about this.
Yep.
And I'm a bit more on board with them being able to pull off requiring games on the original consoles as well.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Just because you could probably make that work most of the time. You could probably have like a basic version of whatever gameplay experience you want now. And it's probably going to stop like very, very forward-looking rendering pipelines, for instance, because they're going to have to be a basic renderer that works on an older spec. But we talked about it at length, and I'm still highly intrigued to see whether this works, Microsoft. But certainly, I think that we probably are at the end of. We are nearing the end of completely definite generations of hardware.
Just personally, like, just from a pure like fan perspective now, setting aside all my other hats, I actually really like this. Like, I'm really interested. I want to get a Scorpio. That's the thing that I want. For some reason, it just appeals to me. Having this sort of very overpowered console is just something that I find interesting to me. And to be honest, actually, if I could afford it, I'd probably get a Neo as well. So it's interesting. Yeah, no, it seems attractive to me as a consumer. These are things I want to think about buying. I want to think about the potential of them. They're things I know and like already, so it's nice.
It's really crazy, but this is legitimately true. I am so put off by how Microsoft's front end looks.
Right.
But that puts me off buying a Scorpio, even though I like a lot of the hardware stuff. I just find the front end to be so not what I want to interact with.
Intriguing. Alex Hayes says, why is everyone so reluctant to accept that I, Alex, am the world's 101st best Diva player, even though I have provided the proof? We discussed that earlier. I'm really fed up with this ranking system that makes Alex think that he has like esports potential, and he will not let this go. He is quite good at Overwatch, I have to say. Playing with him is good, but I just think, you've inflated his expectations too much. He's not ready for the pros. He's too young.
I think it's nice that Blizzard are doing this charity work and making people like Alex happy.
Vinster says, who is the smoothest robot? He's asked a question about robots, I think, for the last 5 or 6 episodes. And I've refused to answer every time, and I'm going to continue to do that now. Thanks very much for listening. Please do join us again next week for more of the same. You can follow me on Twitter. I'm Mode7Games, and he's Ian Hardingham. Goodbye.
Thank you and goodbye.
That's it, children. Time for bed. Don't forget to pay us a visit at www.visitingthevillage.com.